Everyone loves a carefully edited story, the polished version, the safe version, the one where the heroes always look innocent and the villains are easy to recognize. But what happens when the missing pieces suddenly appear? When the version you've trusted your entire life begins falling apart right in front of you? Funny how people don't fear lies nearly as much as they fear the truth that exposes them. The moment the full picture is revealed, loyalty changes, masks begin slipping, and certainty becomes the first casualty. You don't lose your mind because the truth is terrifying. You lose it because you realize how easily reality was rewritten while you were busy believing the performance. They never really hide the truth. They just bury it beneath louder stories. That's the trick. Reality doesn't disappear. It gets drowned out by distractions, polished narratives, and convenient lies repeated so often that people mistake them for memories. Say something often enough, and eventually nobody asks whether it's true. They only ask who said it first. Strange, isn't it? The loudest version usually wins, not because it's accurate, but because it's impossible to ignore. People don't wake up one morning believing a lie. They arrive there one compromise at a time, one accepted assumption, one unquestioned headline, one carefully edited conversation. Every missing detail becomes another brick in a wall separating them from reality. The wall grows slowly enough that nobody notices they're helping build it. By the time they finally look around, they mistake the prison for home. The fascinating part is how willingly people defend stories they've never personally examined. Challenge the narrative. And suddenly they become emotional. Not because you've attacked the truth, but because you've disturbed the comfort attached to believing it. Certainty is addictive. It gives people the illusion of control. If the story stays simple, the world feels manageable. But reality has never been interested in being simple. Some truths aren't hidden behind locked doors. They're hidden in plain sight, protected by disbelief. Everyone sees the clues, yet almost nobody connects them. A contradiction here, a missing detail there, a promise that never matched the action. Individually, they seem harmless. Together, they tell an entirely different story. That's why patterns frighten people more than isolated facts. Patterns can't be dismissed as accidents forever. The moment you begin noticing those patterns, everything starts changing. Conversations sound rehearsed. Outrage feels selective. Apologies become strategic instead of sincere. You begin realizing that people don't always lie by inventing false information. Sometimes they lie by deciding which pieces of the truth you're allowed to see. Leave out enough context, and honesty quietly transforms into manipulation without changing a single fact. What's truly remarkable is how strongly people resist discovering they've been misled. They don't usually thank the person revealing uncomfortable reality. They resent them. Accepting the truth means admitting they trusted the wrong voices, defended the wrong ideas, or ignored the obvious for far too long. Pride becomes a bodyguard protecting false beliefs from uncomfortable questions. That's why hidden truths survive for so long. They aren't protected by intelligence or power alone. They're protected by human nature, by the desire to avoid embarrassment, by the fear of changing deeply held beliefs, by the comfort of familiarity. Exposing the truth isn't difficult because evidence is missing. It's difficult because evidence forces people to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the story they built their identity around was never the whole story in the first place. Every mask tells the same story. Not about the face wearing it, but about the fear hiding behind it. Nobody puts on a disguise because they're comfortable being seen. They wear it because they believe the truth is too dangerous, too embarrassing, or too inconvenient to survive in the open. The performance begins as protection, but over time the performance becomes their identity, and they forget where the act ends and the person begins. It's fascinating how much energy people invest in maintaining appearances. Every smile is carefully timed. Every word is measured. Every reaction is calculated. They don't speak to express themselves anymore. They speak to preserve the image they've worked so hard to create. The audience applauds, never realizing they're clapping for a character instead of a human being. The strange part is that masks are never built to last. They only survive while circumstances remain comfortable. Pressure changes everything. Success reveals hidden pride. Failure exposes hidden fear. Power uncovers hidden arrogance. Loss strips away borrowed confidence. The very situations people try to avoid often become the moments that introduce everyone to who they really are. Watch closely when expectations collapse. That's when rehearsed personalities begin forgetting their lines. Calm people suddenly become cruel. Confident people become defensive. Loyal people quietly disappear. Honest people begin negotiating with the truth. It's almost theatrical. The costume remains the same, but the character underneath finally steps onto the stage. People often believe deception is about telling lies. It rarely starts there. It begins with pretending. Pretending to care. Pretending to listen. Pretending to celebrate someone else's success while secretly resenting it. Pretending to be fearless while living under the constant approval of strangers. Every act requires maintenance, and maintenance eventually becomes exhausting. The remarkable thing about authenticity is that it doesn't require memory. A truthful person doesn't have to remember which version they presented yesterday. A dishonest person carries a library of performances, constantly hoping today's audience never compares notes with yesterday's. The heavier the mask becomes, the more terrified they are of anyone reaching for it. That's why some people react so violently when they're questioned. The question itself isn't the threat. The possibility of exposure is. A single honest observation can unravel years of carefully protected appearances. Suddenly confidence sounds forced. Kindness feels rehearsed. Certainty begins shaking beneath the weight of unanswered questions. The irony is impossible to ignore. The more perfect someone appears, the more fragile that perfection usually becomes. Reality has no obligation to protect carefully crafted images. Time doesn't negotiate with appearances. Pressure doesn't respect reputations. Eventually, everyone encounters a moment no script can prepare them for, a situation no disguise can fully survive, and the mask they've trusted for years quietly slips away, revealing the person who was standing behind it all along. Reality is easier to reshape than most people realize. You don't have to change the facts. You only have to change the order they're presented. Remove a few inconvenient details. Repeat one version often enough, and suddenly an entire crowd begins defending a story they never witnessed. That's the brilliance of manipulation. It doesn't force people to believe a lie. It gently guides them into believing they discovered it on their own. Most people think manipulation looks dramatic. They imagine threats, shouting, or obvious deception. It rarely works that way. Real manipulation is polite, patient. It smiles while quietly rearranging your perspective. It tells you what to notice and, more importantly, what to ignore. Before long, you're no longer seeing reality. You're seeing a carefully edited version designed to produce a predictable reaction. Think about how easily attention can be redirected. Place a bright light in one corner of the room, and everyone stares at it, while the important things happen in the shadows. Human attention is limited, and manipulators understand that better than anyone. They don't need to control everything. They only need to control what you're looking at. That's why emotions become such powerful tools. A frightened mind doesn't investigate. An angry mind doesn't analyze. An offended mind rarely asks deeper questions. Strong emotions narrow your vision until only one explanation feels possible. In that moment, you're not thinking independently anymore. You're responding exactly the way someone hoped you would. The remarkable part is how willingly people participate. They repeat opinions without checking them. They defend conclusions without examining the evidence. They mistake popularity for accuracy and confidence for honesty. Once enough voices repeat the same narrative, disagreement starts feeling dangerous instead of thoughtful. The crowd becomes a mirror reflecting the same illusion back to itself. Manipulation also understands timing. A lie introduced at the right emotional moment can overpower 100 facts presented later. First impressions settle deeply because the mind prefers protecting what it accepted first rather than admitting it was mistaken. Correcting false beliefs often requires more courage than discovering new ones. Notice how manipulation rewards certainty and punishes curiosity. Questions become inconvenient. Doubt becomes weakness. Independent thinking is labeled as rebellion. The goal isn't simply to influence what you believe. It's to discourage you from questioning why you believe it in the first place. Once curiosity disappears, control becomes effortless. The most unsettling realization comes when you discover how often manipulation borrows the language of truth. It speaks about freedom while encouraging dependence. It talks about honesty while hiding context. It promises clarity while creating confusion. The words sound familiar, but the intention quietly moves in the opposite direction. False realities don't survive because they're stronger than the truth. They survive because they're more comfortable, more convenient, and easier to accept than the responsibility that comes with seeing things as they truly are. The moment someone begins questioning the script instead of memorizing it, the illusion starts cracking, and the carefully constructed world built on selective stories begins losing its grip. Illusions don't disappear because someone tells you the truth. They disappear because you finally decide to see what has been standing in front of you all along. That's the uncomfortable part. Most deceptions don't rely on extraordinary intelligence. They rely on ordinary distraction. Keep people busy enough, emotional enough, and entertained enough, and they'll overlook the obvious without anyone having to hide it. Awareness changes the rules of the game. Before it arrives, every coincidence seems believable. Every excuse sounds reasonable. Every carefully rehearsed smile appears genuine. But once your eyes begin connecting patterns instead of isolated moments, the entire performance starts unraveling. Suddenly, you stop judging people by what they promise and begin measuring them by what they repeatedly do. Patterns are dangerous because they don't argue. They don't shout or demand attention. They simply keep appearing until denial becomes more exhausting than acceptance. One contradiction might be an accident. Two might be unfortunate timing. But eventually the repetition becomes impossible to ignore. At that point, reality doesn't need to convince you anymore. It quietly introduces itself. People often believe awareness is a gift. In many ways, it's a burden. Once you've recognized manipulation, pretending not to see it becomes nearly impossible. You notice the compliment designed to create obligation. The apology offered only after consequences arrive. The confidence that disappears the moment accountability enters the room. Things that once seemed ordinary suddenly reveal layers you never realized existed. The interesting part is how others respond when your awareness grows. Some become defensive without being accused. Others begin explaining themselves before you've even asked a question. It's remarkable how often guilty consciences volunteer information nobody requested. Truth has a way of making masks uncomfortable long before anyone reaches out to remove them. Awareness also changes your relationship with fear. Before understanding, uncertainty feels threatening. After understanding, uncertainty becomes an invitation to observe instead of react. You stop rushing toward conclusions because you've learned that appearances often arrive before intentions reveal themselves. Patience becomes sharper than impulse, and silence becomes more revealing than endless conversation. Manipulation depends on automatic reactions. It expects outrage, panic, guilt, or approval to appear on command. Awareness interrupts that process. Instead of reacting, you pause. Instead of accepting, you examine. Instead of following the crowd, you quietly ask the question everyone else seems too uncomfortable to consider. That single pause is enough to disrupt an entire strategy built on emotional predictability. The irony is almost poetic. The people who fear awareness most are usually the ones benefiting from confusion. Clarity threatens every carefully maintained illusion because it shifts power back to the observer. Once someone begins seeing beyond appearances, performances lose their influence, empty words lose their magic, and carefully crafted narratives begin collapsing beneath the weight of simple observation, revealing truths that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along. Freedom rarely arrives with applause. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic victories. It begins in silence, in the exact moment a person stops believing every story they've been handed. That's where the real escape begins. Not from a place, not from another person, but from the invisible prison built by unquestioned beliefs. The strongest chains are never made of iron. They're made of ideas, repeated until they feel impossible to challenge. Truth has a peculiar habit of making those chains feel unbearably heavy. The moment you see them, you can no longer pretend they aren't there. That's why so many people avoid uncomfortable questions. Questions lead to answers, and answers demand change. Remaining comfortable is much easier than admitting you've spent years protecting an illusion that never deserved your loyalty. People often imagine truth as something violent, something that destroys everything it touches. The reality is quieter. Truth doesn't destroy what is real. It only removes what was never stable to begin with. Fake confidence begins to crumble. Borrowed opinions lose their authority. Fear disguised as wisdom starts sounding strangely hollow. One honest realization can undo years of carefully maintained deception. The fascinating part is how the mind reacts when truth arrives. At first, it resists. It searches desperately for excuses, hoping to preserve familiar beliefs. It tries bargaining with reality, asking if perhaps the old story wasn't entirely wrong. Pride whispers that changing your mind is weakness. Yet the strongest minds have never feared correction. They fear remaining trapped by false certainty. Once truth settles in, your perspective quietly changes. You stop chasing approval from people who never intended to understand you. You stop measuring your worth through opinions that shift with convenience. You stop confusing popularity with integrity and attention with respect. The noise surrounding you grows louder, yet somehow it loses its ability to disturb your thinking. It's remarkable how many battles disappear the moment clarity replaces confusion. Arguments that once consumed your energy suddenly feel meaningless. Manipulation becomes easier to recognize because you've learned to observe instead of immediately reacting. Every attempt to control your emotions starts revealing more about the person attempting it than about you. Truth also carries an unexpected responsibility. Once you've seen reality clearly, pretending ignorance becomes exhausting. You can no longer blame every setback on coincidence or every betrayal on bad luck. Patterns become visible, choices become more deliberate, and excuses lose the comfort they once provided. Awareness replaces assumption, and accountability quietly takes the place of denial. The greatest irony is that truth doesn't imprison the mind. It releases it from the exhausting burden of defending illusions. No longer forced to maintain false stories, you begin thinking with remarkable clarity. The world remains unpredictable. People remain complicated, and uncertainty never completely disappears. But the fear of being deceived loses its influence because the mind that values truth above comfort can no longer be easily controlled.